I'm so excited to be here. Got here late, so I'm sad I missed sort of the whole week, but really glad I'm catching at least today's sessions. Thank you for the introduction, Neville, so I'm not going to introduce myself. I've got panelists sitting with me who I will introduce in a bit, but I think let's start with a presentation from Graham Sparks, who is Director at IED Consulting, who will be presenting the Civil Society Toolkit for Working with Business, and then we can get into the discussion. I'll explain a little bit about what we're going to talk about straight after Graham has spoken to us about the toolkit.
Yeah, good morning or nearly good afternoon, everyone. Just checking on the sound. Can you hear me okay in the venue there in Cape Town?
Yes, we can.
Good, excellent. Again, thanks. I did just want to start with a couple of words. I had the opportunity to listen into the previous session and to hear the living testimony from a number of the speakers was very humbling. We're going to talk today in this session about the interface between business and civil society, and I'm well aware, and indeed I'll talk about some of the issues that come up, some of the stereotypes, some of the myths, etc. But I'm also very aware that, you know, sitting here in London, the mindset and the activities which may take place here in Europe do not necessarily translate across the oceans and across geographies. And the challenges that you face in South Africa, or people face in South America or Southeast Asia, which I'm very familiar with, are different, and need to be addressed with a great deal of cultural sensitivity. I would say going into this session is focused on the reinvention part of Kopano, so the reinvention part of your conference, about the future. And I reflect back. I'm old enough to just about remember when it was illegal to be homosexual in the UK. Something that was repealed just over 50 years ago now. And I can certainly remember as a young teenager and an adult, the dreadful piece of legislation, the cruel piece of legislation, Section 28, which in the UK limited or pretty much prevented discussion around LGBT, gender identity, etc., for people under 18. That's gone now, but it only went 20 years ago. So, I just want to acknowledge the last few minutes. I will move on with my own piece now, but acknowledge that, but also perhaps offer that there is hope, there is change, and things can move forward. And I know that that's our collective objective as we're here today. So again, let me just bring the slides through. We're going to talk about the Civil Society Business Toolkit, which is a piece of work we did last year with Workplace Pride, working with Open for Business from their Kenya team, and also the other foundation here in South Africa, who are one of the sponsors. Let me just tee this up in terms of, there we go. Just to orientate around us, there's going to be two of us here today. Myself, I'll spend about 15 minutes talking through the Civil Society Business Toolkit. And then David Pollard is going to join the panel. It's just a purely practical issue here. You get kind of two for the price of one, which hopefully is a benefit. But I actually have to get to the airport as I'm traveling to Berlin this afternoon. So sorry I can't be here for the full session. But David, of course, will step in and cover the panel as well. Our third collaborator on this was Yvonne Matoni, who's the country director for Open for Business based in Kenya. And she worked heavily on the research which backed up and supported the work that we've done here. Let me just, a little bit my own background. I spent 35 years working for Shell, mainly in London, mainly in the UK and the Netherlands, but I lived in a number of other countries as well. And more recently, I've got involved much more with civil society. I'm a member of Workplace Pride's advisory board, and I've done a number of projects with Workplace Pride. I've been quite active in the LGBT civil society area. But I was aware, really from both sides, both from the business side and civil society side, that sometimes we seem to operate in business worlds. And indeed, the previous speakers touched on some of this. So these are a little bit perhaps stereotypical, but we think of business being focused on profits, on human capital, on short term, and certainly in the world of LGBTI inclusion, I think perhaps tending to be followers. So I'm sure there are people in the room who would disagree with that, but that's perhaps the stereotype we see. On the other hand, you see civil society very much focused on business, on principles, strong care and attention to the community, longer term view, and tending to be leaders. And sometimes I looked at this with both hats on, the business hat and civil society, and I saw two well-intended groups staring across a space at each other and seeing difference, seeing a lot of differences. But I think what's so important of this are our shared values, and the things that bring us together. What makes, not the things that make us different, the things that we have in common. And yeah, I've listed some of the shared values there, which I believe to be important. I mention this up front partly because of the context that we're talking about today, but secondly, as I go through, and I've got sort of 4 or 5 slides to share with you as I talk you through this the civil society toolkit, and we get into the panel discussion. I think those things we have in common are perhaps more important than the things that separate us. So let's get into some of the heart of this. What is this toolkit about? The inception of this was probably about nearly 2 years ago now. Actually, working with the Global Equality Fund and the other foundation, the two sponsors of this work, and looking at looking a little bit at some of those differences, but looking at how business can support civil society and vice versa in order to progress LGBT inclusion across the world. But we wanted something that was practical. It's very nice to have a book on a shelf or a blog on a website, but we wanted something that people could do something with. So we've developed this guide, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail later, which looks at helping civil society organisations work more closely with the business world. Hopefully giving them benefits in terms of accessing a larger support base. The access part's really important. Access to resources, which is not just money, it could be time, it could be people, it could be expertise, it could be opening doors, opening avenues which don't necessarily exist to a local organisation, and hopefully creating some long-term and positive changes for our community. Again, I do stress this thing is practical, that behind it there is a website, there is a downloadable PDF, and this whole thing is very live. We actually formally launched this last week on IDHOT Day on the 17th of May, so we're pretty active in terms of getting the message out there through social media and other channels. And also, we hope if you like it, and we'll give you all the links, etc. You can promote, discuss, and share with others as well. We want to get the message out there. It's a dialogue, it's a discussion, it's people using this that's going to be very important. Again, with that focus on reinvention and that focus on the future. And again, just briefly mention them, but I'd like to recognise the other foundations, the important sponsor here, working with the Seven Sealer, Linda and others, has been really critical to this, and also has ensured that this piece of work has very much a global and a local perspective on it. So it's not just a piece of work coming from a UK mindset or a Dutch mindset, etc. We've tried to make this thing truly global. So why does it matter? I kind of hesitate almost to say anything, because why does it matter was what we heard, or what I heard at least in the last 20 minutes of that previous presentation. And I'm sure those of you in the room and on this conference virtually will have your own views and have heard more during this conference. But a couple of things, perhaps as summary points there. There's this idea of intersectionality is important. I think from my point of view, I also work a lot on gender inclusion as well, and Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and some of the other social movements of the last 5+ years. I think have been important. And I also well recognise in certain countries those have been minimised or limited in terms of how people can get behind them. But I think there is an increased awareness, and I think using that as a positive force for change is important. But again, as we heard from speakers in the last one, popularism and politics certainly having a negative effect on our world post-COVID. I don't think any of us know all of the impacts of that yet. But I see even in the UK now a rise in LGBTI hate crimes. And okay, you can rationalise it and say it's because people feel more open to reporting. Well, yeah, maybe, but the point is the numbers are going up, and that's concerning. and also the issues which are put down to politics and issues around woke behaviour, etc. But whatever the rationale for them, being exclusionary towards the transgender community, and that's not good. We need to stop that, and hopefully organisations like ours can help to change that. And again, we also see some of these ideological changes becoming enshrined in legislation, which is ironic. You know, you look at the ILGA report every year, and you do see progress, and yet, you know, we see these changes in legislation coming through, even in parts of Eastern Europe now, which are having a negative effect on the community. But I think business plays a role here. I mean, again, you know, I think it's very easy to be cynical and say that business is only interested in profit. But having worked for a large and profitable organisation for many years, that organisation is made up of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who do care, who do have a point of view, who do have a social conscience, and you know, therefore, businesses being silent really is no longer an option from the point of view of employees and point of view of customers, point of view of their overall position in society. And again, what we're trying to do through this toolkit is bring together business and CSOs in a more constructive and a more practical way. Let's look briefly at how the toolkit works. Quite a nice quote from Levis from the Solomon Reed Society, who we're also working with through Workplace Pride. I won't read it out, but again, he reinforces this point about business and CSO having more in common, and lists some of the areas that are important there. And we've developed this toolkit really to help civil society organisations look at how your objectives align with those of business. And again, time and again, I find that actually the alignment is much closer than we might expect. Help to identify which businesses to work with. That's not necessarily the obvious ones, but how you can move that forward, how you can get your foot in the door, how you can get listened to. And again, we heard some of that from the previous speakers. What messages are we giving? What's in it for business? What's in it for the civil society organisations? And probably, and there is actually a specific section in the toolkit which looks at this, which is why do business with business? So again, with a civil society hat on, why would you go down that route? And again, I would argue so much of that is around access to customers and suppliers and employees, access to allies, access to resources, access to policymakers. Of course, every civil society organisation will be doing that anyway, but this is about increasing scope, increasing scale, and finding ways to do this together. The toolkit itself, again, it probably doesn't work, but that is the toolkit, and you'll be pleased to know it's available on the web. It's available as a downloadable version. Essentially, comes in four main parts, and we've done research behind this to reinforce some of the points. There's a section. The first section is getting started. We then do quite a detailed piece on why this matters, which is both the business case for LGBTI inclusion, and you know, we may feel we're beyond that, but businesses still need that. They still need to understand why it's important. They need to understand the rational part and the emotional part. We have the tools themselves, and I'll come to explain at least at high level those in a moment. And probably most important is the fourth section. It's about commitments and actions. So you've read it, you've looked at it, you've discussed it. But what are you going to do about it? And what is business going to do about it? And how can civil society organisations help with that? So again, those are the four main sections. Let's dive in and just look at the tools in a little more detail. And again, you know, please go to the toolkit website if you would like to go through this in some more depth. But we've essentially come up with 8 tools, and some of these are, you know, are very practical things you'd expect to see in an LGBTI inclusion toolkit. So support and policy, for example, is a good one of that. But we started off with a piece around understanding myths and mindsets, and this a little bit refers back to what I talked about at the beginning. These two worlds that we see, where we look across the divide at each other, and we felt that was a good place to have the understanding. There's no point in going in and having a detailed discussion about, I don't know, same-sex health benefits, for example. Important point, but you're not going to get there unless we understand each other and can work across and work on the things that we have in common, rather than the things we have in different that are different. So we spend a fair amount of time on that. We do cover the business case, and then moving over to the right, we're also trying to tackle some of the more difficult issues, particularly around encouraging business advocacy. My own experience is businesses are cautious. They worry about brand. They worry about getting too far ahead. They worry about being out there on their own. They worry about all sorts of things. But in practice, advocacy is possible. It can be done. I've seen it done very well through businesses. Very many examples of that, particularly in countries where there is homophobia in place, and those organisations themselves will have their own policies and practices around inclusion and anti-discrimination, etc. And that there are things that can be done. So I remember a case in Singapore a few years ago where the local authorities basically came up with an edict or a barrier whereby on the annual celebration of LGBTI inclusion, so-called Pink Dot Day, the event went ahead, but they managed to prevent put in rules to stop expatriates joining it. So in other words, that cut out a lot of the allies, a lot of the support from companies in Singapore who might wish to turn up to this event and show their support, etc. So a number of companies said, okay, fair enough, we're not going to break the law, but what we can do is invite Pink Dot into our building and have events there. So it's a small example, but it's a little piece of advocacy. It gets the message across, and I would argue that if we're creative, there are ways of doing that. And we also spend quite some time, the last one, about supporting sensitive countries. And again, going back to the previous discussion, I'm acutely sensitive of the challenges that you face, or what is going on in Zambia or Mozambique or Zimbabwe or South Africa is not the same as what's going on in the Netherlands or the US or the UK. I get that. But I would also say that as I've been around the world, talked to many, many people on the subject, whilst there may be legislation and issues around homosexuality, around sexual identity, etc., which severely get in the way and in some cases put people at risk, I've yet to find any law which prevents us respecting each other and acknowledging each other and being part of society. So again, for those of you at the front line, this may sound a bit soft, but I've had personal experience of conversations in the Middle East where, frankly, you do not start a conversation talking about LGBTI inclusion, but you can start a conversation talking about respect and how we treat each other. So again, you're probably all very familiar with some of these themes, but we try and bring those out in the toolkit and bring some practicality into that. Last couple of slides, and then we'll move into a deeper discussion and get your hear from the panel and get your questions as well. I've mentioned the toolkit a number of times. So what is it? Well, first of all, it's as you can see, a PDF on the left-hand side, 64 pages with all the tools. We secondly have a website, Civil Society Business Toolkit.org. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but you can see that from the title on the front of the toolkit. And from there, you can download the toolkit. Of course, it's free, and we also do not require any registration. I have no email addresses or anything, because we recognise some of the safety issues that people may feel in certain locations, certain countries in downloading this thing. So we hope you go and have a look at it. We hope you find it of value, but most importantly, we hope you do something with it as well. Which brings me to my last slide, which is, bear with me. Yeah, there we are. Commitments and actions. The last section of the toolkit is around commitments and actions and how we can personalise those, what we can do. And there's more to it than that. And we look at the plans. We also look at it in terms of the maturity of the business that you might be working with. Some are scrambling around. They hardly even understand what LGBTI inclusion is all about. Others may be much more mature, but really struggling with advocacy or how to implement their good global intent in countries where homophobia is present. And there's a whole scale, a whole range of organisations and where they are on this journey. So we deal with that in some depth as well. But this is getting very practical in terms of what you could do, and again, read it for yourself. But download it, read it, discuss it, and promote it. I don't mean promote it on behalf of Workplace Pride, but promote it in your communities. Get those conversations going. Use it as a way to build a relationship with business, both individual businesses, but also across businesses as well. And we hope you all find something in that. So again, I've rushed through quite a lot of content here. The toolkit itself, and again, let's just run back to that previous slide. There we are. Yeah, civilsocietybusinesstoolkit.org. Please go and take a look. Please download it. We welcome feedback, of course, and there's a route to give feedback there as well. And we hope you find this useful in terms of your future discussions. And we hope it's something that will be around for a while. As I mentioned before, our sponsors are the Global Equality Fund and the other foundation. We're promoting actively at the moment, but we also intend to take that forward going ahead, both with businesses, but also, for example, with the diplomatic sector as well, who've been helpful in terms of sponsoring and supporting events around the world. That's going to be it from me. I think I should hand back to Farai now, and we'll see where the discussion goes from here. And as I mentioned, my colleague David Pollard, who's the Executive Director of Workplace Pride, will be joining the panel discussion. I'll listen in for a few minutes and then I'll scoot off to the airport. But thank you very much for your time today. All right.
Thank you so much, Graham. I'm going to bring in our panelists into the conversation. We've got Daniel Lukonde Kasonde, who is the Commercial Business Partner for SAP Africa and the Global Co-Lead for SAP Pride. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we've got Samuel Matsikure, who is a human rights activist and programs manager at GALS. And of course, we've got David Pollard, who's the Executive Director at Workplace Pride. To double check, David, you are dialed in and you can hear us.
Yes, I can. Nice to see you, Farai.
Perfect. So we've been asked to speak about LGBTIQ plus economic inclusion and participation, as well as the case for deeper engagement with businesses. And I think there are really two ways that are distinct but connected that we can look at this issue, and I think we should try to tackle both just because of the richness that we have on the panel. Again, we are the panel that is standing between people and lunchtime, so let's keep our answers brief, let's keep our conversation rich. Really do want to bring in the rest of the audience as well, and we have around 30 minutes for questions, so we'll try and keep this part as brief as possible because we really want to hear from everybody else as well. I think the two ways in which we can start looking at this topic of LGBTIQ plus inclusion and participation, as well as CSO engagement with business, is really on both a micro and a macro scale. So we can look at what individual businesses or private sector businesses are doing within their companies around LGBTIQ plus inclusion from a diversity and inclusion point of view, and how they're working with CSOs to sort of, bring in the element of economic inclusion for the community specifically. And we can also look at it in terms of the macro, so how business is contributing to social change within societies on a wider scale. And I think we've seen a few examples of that globally as well. Samuel, I want to start with you. I think often the relationship between business and civil society can be described or characterized as confrontational or having a very deep trust deficit. And I'm curious to hear from you specifically about what you think business could be doing better to try and bridge that trust deficit.
Well, I think
sorry, if
business.
you don't mind,
yeah,
I also forgot, just so everyone can see your pretty face.
Yes.
And we're social distancing,
I was trying
so I
to
think we should
avoid.
be fine. Oh, okay. now I'm the
Yeah.
delinquent. I'm sorry. You can put it
No,
on
it's
when
fine.
you're finished speaking.
No, you'll be
Please
fine.
go ahead.
Yeah, I think what needs to happen is that even as a sector, from where I come from, we need to engage more with business, because even at a level where a lot of us do advertise for companies to submit their portfolios when we are doing procurement, the mistrust is that when we engage with business, the public tends to then label certain businesses as going, for instance, against the law, or perhaps promoting homosexuality through the way they're engaging with different organizations that are working with LGBTI communities. But we also need to look at the global trends that are currently happening, where businesses also are trying to provide a positive image for inclusivity, but also diversity, regardless of them being located wherever they are, either it's in Europe or America, but these companies are also within our locality. And I think we need to engage more, and I think that can also help to develop trust. But you also realize that many companies also have a social responsibility for wherever they are working for communities. And I think that's something we have not really tried to use for mileage in terms of creating visibility, but also making sure that the companies that are working with our communities are also trying to be inclusive. And I think there's always that tension where companies, because they are profit-making, and I think people kept talking about capitalist states, they want to make profit. So sometimes they don't want to risk their brand being labeled as associated with groups that are deemed not only criminal, but also are stigmatized. But I think what we've learned also, just for me, following some of the trends and discussions that are happening in South Africa when it comes to business, I feel that the level of engagement, but also rating companies in terms of their performance, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of looking at their internal policies, how inclusive are they, how also are they also improving in terms of when they're hiring, how are they also making sure that there's diverse groups of people that are also coming from our community, is something that can continue to build the trust that we need. But also someone say, I think it was the previous panel, where they also spoke about the current trends and messaging that is also coming from our countries. We are talking about leaving no one behind. Whether we're looking at the SDGs, we are looking at health, we are looking at development. And that also should be a message that we should encourage companies to understand what that means when it comes to our community. Leaving no one behind also means that businesses need to change their way of practice. And sometimes companies don't know how to go around that. Because in my country, I've seen experiences where people perhaps of a different sexual orientation or gender identity are outed in a company, and they reach out to us and say, how do we deal with this case? And part of it, when you then go into their policies, perhaps they're quite silent about issues of gender, they're quite about issues of sexual orientation, or they're quite about diversity. And I think the fact that they continue to keep the individual within their company starts also changing the brand and how people view that company. And we've seen very talented, experienced LGBTI people being put on the forefront of those companies, and they're still, those companies have not dissolved or disappeared because they happen to have somebody who has a gay identity or a transgender identity in the process. And I think that in itself are models that we can actually use to help have a discussion with business around such issues of creating trust and inclusivity. But I think we still have a long way to go. But also looking at Africa, a lot of our countries are struggling economically, but that should be the time when we are also taking the opportunity to engage with business.
All right, thank you so much for that. David, I want to bring you in. I think we hear the term business case for LGBTIQ plus inclusion all the time, when I think from a personal point of view, I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the organizations I'm representing today, but I think that can be quite a crude negotiation of space and of humanity. And I think, importantly, it also has an underlying assumption that necessarily the values that business and civil society stand for can never kind of correlate. That there's always an inherent conflict in there. And I think Graham spoke a little bit to some of the different ways in which we can think about shared value within this collaborative space. I'm curious to hear about what that shared value looks like, right? So I think there's the assumption is always that CSOs have to learn to speak the language of business in order to kind of get a foot in. So what are the different ways in which there is actually a lot of shared value, and how do we start to understand those and start to maximize on them?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you very much for that. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here, and I think it might be good as I answer your question to give you just a very brief overview of what Workplace Pride does, just in a couple of seconds. So we're an LGBTIQ plus based nonprofit organization based here in the Netherlands. And we work with more than 100 multinationals, governments, and civil society organizations and universities on the topic of LGBTIQ plus workplace inclusion. And to your question, I think what's important to note is that here in the Netherlands, marriage equality, of course, passed in 2001 as the first country in the world to do this. But corporations in the business world, they were not ready for this. They were not prepared for the cultural change that they had to go through. So it took them also time to understand really what they needed to do, and they have, over the years, come to realize that the business case that you're talking about is very much for them that they need to be attractive to our community, to my community, LGBTIQ plus people around the world. This is important for them because they need to be able to hire people, including LGBTIQ plus people. They need to be able to create workplaces where everybody can be themselves. And this is for them really has become crucial, and as Graham was alluding to a little bit, because of the changes, the social changes that have been happening in the past couple of years, this is no longer a luxury item for most businesses. It's very much something that they have to do, because most younger people will not work for a company if they are seen to be anti-LGBTIQ plus, at least here. But again, we work with multinationals who are all over the world, and it's something that is beginning to permeate the discussion all over the place. But a little bit more to zoom in on your point, I think it's important to understand that, again, I've spent 20 years in the corporate world and now 15 years in civil society, and that intersection, it doesn't have to be something that's difficult, because there are a lot of overlaps, as Graham was again saying. It's important for businesses to be able to continue to do their business, and they do want to reach out as much as possible to civil society, of all types of civil society organizations, but they often do not know how. And so for the civil society, particularly for LGBTIQ plus organizations and people, it's important for us to understand that it's almost like a captive audience ready to understand, but we need to simply understand how to speak to them. I heard somebody say before, I think it was Samuel, was saying, we need to speak their language. And this is really the modus operandi that we have used within Workplace Pride for more than 15 years. We as civil society need to speak the language of the businesses, and businesses need to learn how to speak the language of civil society. And that's actually what the toolkit tries to bridge that gap a little bit. I don't know if that answered your question directly, but it's an effort from both sides, is my point.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. And I think that's a really important point, and it's something that Samuel was speaking about as well. Daniel, I'd love to bring you in as our only panelist who is sort of representing business, myself excluded, but curious about how SAP has been doing on this journey. I think both speakers have looked at both, kind of looking at businesses' collaboration through the diversity and inclusion lens, so what you're doing for your employees that are LGBTIQ+, and what you're doing in regions where you're not operating in rights-respecting environments. What are you doing around the diversity and inclusion lens? And then in addition to that, I think we've also heard a lot about, and this is in general today, even with the previous conversations, about a responsibility to social change or a social responsibility that business has. So would love to bring you in and hear a little bit about how SAP Africa is thinking about those two elements.
Thank you very much. So SAP is Systems Applications Products. It's a German IT company. It started off in 1972 and currently employs over 105,000 employees globally. And our corporate social responsibility programs are tailored around the United Nations Sustainable Goals of Development. So you find to say that's something we mirror against in what we do. So we try and build digital skills, work with social enterprises, non-profits and social enterprises, and also we're trying to connect people with purpose. So our story in LGBTI inclusion stems back to 2001. A group of SAP employees would meet in the canteen in Hamburg at our head office in Germany. They identified as queer and they would have lunch together. So this group grew, and to this day, we've got about 10,500 members of the Pride Network. In terms of what we're doing, so we're trying to look at, first and foremost, growing the LGBTQI community. So we're also looking at leadership acceleration in as far as the LGBTQI employees are concerned. How can we help you in terms of your career progression? Then we're also looking at collaboration. I think this is why it's very important in terms of how do you collaborate externally and internally. And fourthly, we're trying to build best practice in terms of some of the stuff that we're doing in as far as LGBTQI inclusion is concerned. So internally, we're trying to collaborate with other existing employee network groups like the Business Women's Network, as well as the Black Employees Network as well. Externally, I think we've done quite a number of remarkable things, both in Africa as well as the rest outside of the continent. We've got an amazing refugee project going on in the US with Tent organization, whereby we're mentoring LGBTQI refugees, about 1,000 of them, in terms of how best can we support them in terms of equipping them with digital skills and the rest. You find to say we are a business and we are not a charity organization, but we're also trying to see how best can we give back to the community based on what we have. We're in the ICT space and data is very important to us. The recent World Bank study shows that in terms of the world population, 60% are excluded from the digital economy. So these are the areas in which we're trying to explore how best can we make a difference. Here in Africa, unfortunately, we also serve in jurisdictions where they don't support the inclusion of the LGBTQI. We've got customers both in the private and public sectors. And we're also trying to explore how best can we make a difference. So again, we're looking to identify areas in which we can mentor LGBTQI inclined institutions, but while also being respectful in terms of the various legislations coming in these different jurisdictions. So basically our business case for us is in trying to align mutual purpose with the different organizations out there. How can we make a difference? In South Africa, we've actually participated in the survey surveys, and also we've been part of the round table. And also we've engaged quite a lot in a number of initiatives. But again, we're also trying to explore. I think that's one of the motivations why we're here is we're trying to look at opportunities. How can we partner and work together? Digital skills is something which is very evident and required within our LGBTQ community here in Africa. And we're here to put a hand up to say, how can we collaborate and work together in these initiatives?
Yeah, thank you so much. I would really like to bring the audience in at this point. So if there are any questions, please head to the mics on the sides and let's get some questions in. If not, I still have plenty more. So, are you coming in with a question, Seven? Okay. Careful, don't almost die like me.
I know. Am I on?
Yes.
All right, solid. This is online. You remember we have some folks streaming in on Zoom. Jackie Benson Mabombo asks, how can organizations who are very reliant currently on donor funding be assisted by business and become more business-minded from the way they manage themselves and address areas like their employee relations to finding new ways to be self-sufficient in their funding? This seems like an important way business can partner with organizations and empower us for the longer term. At the same time, the benefit to business being exposed to the issues we are currently championing, and being allies for us. The question was at the beginning, and I'll repeat it. How can organizations who are very reliant currently on donor funding be assisted by business?
That's a fantastic one. David, do you want to try to tackle that one?
Yes,
see
I've
any
seen this
others,
question.
Go ahead.
I've seen this question there, so I'm really glad it's been asked. I think a lot of it is really something that's been said before again, is putting yourself in the mindset of the organization that you're trying to influence. This is exactly what Workplace Pride did when we first started out. We ask ourselves, what is it that an organization needs to know? And I can tell you now, again, after all these years, that what they really want to know is how can they engage? And how can they actually work together with communities to, first of all, help their own community internally, their own LGBTI network or community. They might not even have a network, but to find out how they can get that dialogue going. So what we have found, and this is partly in the research of the toolkit as well, is that if civil society organizations can actually come to the table with a degree of confidence, and I know that sounds hard in many cases, but come to the table of that we have something to offer you, business. We want to help you because we know about our community. We know how we can work together with you to help you as a business profile yourself with our community. So it's coming from a place of strength. And I'm not just being a cheerleader here, it's really, there is a strength in knowing your own community and knowing and understanding that a business wants to see this and understand it. Now, to be very concrete about it, what we did as Workplace Pride is we actually went to some of our business organizations and said, look, this is the service we're offering you. And we actually put a price tag on it. So it's not funding in the sense of asking for money. It's like we will provide you a service. Now that service can be even things such as visibility, having a logo. And again, it's not pink washing it, they're actually engaging with the community. It can be, understanding what the community thinks about as consumers as well. And again, it might be a big leap from working in a civil society organization who's been working on civil rights and human rights for so long to get into the mindset of a business. But I'm pushing the toolkit here a little bit, but in the toolkit, that's exactly what we tackle. How to go about it, how to make a presentation, who to contact, work through very, our own community, people like Samuel or whoever who are working in the organizations, interact with them first of all, put together a strategy, and then go forward from a place of confidence. And I'm saying this because you're much more likely to have progress if you do present yourself as a strong organization who knows what you want, as opposed to just saying we need money. Because a business, and again I know this from personal experience, a business, as long as they have a reason to help or to work with an organization, they'll do it because it's also in their interest.
Or I'd like to just add a tidbit onto what you were saying, David, is also thinking about the sectors that a business is operating in, right? Thinking about what the business of that business is. So are they a mining company? Are they a retailer? And thinking about where those cross-cutting areas are in your work as a CSO, as well as what that business's business is actually, and finding ways to create a sustainable relationship, because that's kind of a lot more impactful, essentially. And I would love to hear your views on this, Daniel, as well. But I think we've got another question, so we may come back to this one, because I think it's the point of the panel, actually, that question. Please go ahead.
Hello, I just want to give my question, and then the panelists can answer the first question and then mine.
Okay, so please introduce yourself as well.
Okay, my name is Kanyanta Kakana. I'm from an organization called African Trans Women's Alliance. So we just founded in 2020, and we work out of Lusaka, Zambia. We're a community-based organization and community-run. So I just wanted to ask, this is a very good toolkit, and it's very, very powerful. But my question is, how do we, for example, communities that are very at basic grassroots levels, and don't even understand, like, don't have any literacy, don't have any of that, but maybe have certain talents, for example, like cooking skills, selling skills, you know, like people that want to start businesses but don't have the ability to formally run. How can, you know, things like this toolkit be translated to community members at like that very, very, very basic level?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that's directly for you, David.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And it's an excellent question because that is something that we've run across. Of course, the dynamic in general is that we're talking about larger companies that have the resources to create networks, et cetera. However, I think the message of the toolkit can still be used at any level, even with a smaller organization, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, because it's the question. It's really, again, changing the mindset of the civil society organization and even as an individual yourself. What can I offer you that will help you? And by doing that, we're also saying I'm helping myself as an LGBTIQ plus person. I can't, to be honest, think of any specific example of what you just asked, but it really is a question of changing your mind or changing the way that you approach businesses and helping them to understand that I can be of benefit to you. And it could be even such simple things as I've helped set up this organization. That's a skill. That's a skill to bring people together and to work. And a business of any size that recognizes that and understands what you've done as an individual or as an organization, I mean, you'll have a much better chance of making progress with them and actually, you know, enforcing the socioeconomic progress that you want to make if you can approach it from this perspective. It's a relatively vague response to your answer, but I hope that you'll understand it really is about taking a different tack, actually.
Yeah, and just to add on to that one, I think something that we probably haven't addressed in our conversation is the role of third parties and the importance of third parties that straddle kind of both worlds and that understand both worlds. I think probably throughout this week, there's been a lot of examples of those. Just today, we've got organizations like Workplace Pride, we've got organizations like the LGBTIQ plus Forum. There are advisor organizations that really understand the CSO space and understand LGBTIQ plus inclusion from the CSO space, but also have a link with business and are able to kind of advise. And I think Open for Business is one from a resources point of view as well. So you know, the role of third parties is also quite important in whether it's sharing resources or kind of directly being the linkage between civil society, between grassroots civil society and business as well. Samuel, I want to hear from you about your own experiences as girls with business, what some of the barriers have been, and some of the ways that you think business can be doing better at 1, 2, 3 in order to kind of solidify the collaboration and make it a lot more impactful.
Yeah, just to also pick the question that was asked about small grassroots organization and business, I think it's also for us to understand what we really mean by business. Because when we look at our community, we are all coming from very diverse geographical and also industrial developmental stages that are quite different. And when you look at our communities, there are different models of business that's currently happening. And at that level, when you look at that, how then do we use even this toolkit in answering your question? We have economies like Zimbabwe where business is quite very informal in the way it's structured. So you also have people in the community that are developing their own businesses. But we also have some that are struggling to even start business. And what I've learned from interacting with community members that are also running their businesses is that they are also interested in helping the communities we come from to also start their own businesses. So we do have people that are skilled, that are innovative in our community, that are willing to make time to come and help others to start their own businesses. And that's something we need to look at and tap into, because it then helps to guide others. How do you develop a small business plan, even if you want to sell your vegetables by the corner? How do you manage your finances when you're getting income on a daily basis? And vis-a-vis also the demands of your daily living where you need to pay rent and so on. How do you grow your business at that level? We have people that are doing cross-border buying and selling of products. How do you even start that? Because a lot of people don't have idea. They see people doing it, but they don't know how to do it. So we also have at that very level where people need to learn the skills, and we have people in our community who are able to help us to actually channel that. The same way we've also approached the health sector, where we now have what we call our peer educators and so on, who are helping communities to do prevention and so on. We need to also find cadres in our communities who are also able to share the skills and the experience that they have. Then we also have that are already employed within different companies, who are also experiencing on a daily basis the stigma and discrimination, especially when we look at our context where there's a lot of homophobia. We do have trans men and women that are transitioning within our contexts. Some started transitioning when they were already in the workplace, others are interfacing at the job market. So we also have that tension where those interfacing with the job market are finding it difficult to be subsumed into the business sector, because the way they present themselves and the way that the business model we come from is structured in such a way that is very moralistic in the way it looks at individuals. We've had situations where people who have then transitioned in that company or are found out to be gay or bisexual in the process of doing business are told, well, I'll need to dismiss you because my company was found from the using Christian values. So it's also something that we spoke about. What is our value? And what is the value of business when it's interacting with the LGBTI community? Because not only are we consumers, but we are innovative, we are skilled, we are talented, we have all these diverse skills, regardless of one not being educated, but there's just something about us that is very creative. And we need to be able to sell that value to individuals that are running companies, that I could bring value to your company, regardless of how I might present myself. Then we've also had situations where we are also getting donor funding, but we still have to buy products, whether it's for our workshops, the t-shirts that we are all wearing, the laptops that we are using. I would not want to spend my cent in a company that I know they are homophobic.
Right.
So we also need to create that business relationship where we are saying, if I'm to buy products from you, I need to understand what are your values. And if you say you're found from a Christian value, I will not give you business. Because what is currently sustaining most of our economies in our countries, it's also the NGO sector. Right. And we need to take advantage of that and develop that relationship where it's a give and take. And at that negotiating table, we need to be able to turn around the ways of practice of business that is inclusive and diverse. We've also had situations where individuals, after giving them a tender, they'll turn around and say, we no longer want to do business with you because you're an LGBTI organization. And that's okay. Because then the next time we get somebody who's able to give us business, they realize that that company is also growing because they're getting business not only from girls, but also other LGBTI persons have heard that a specific company is quite welcoming, it's quite open to receive clients that are LGBTI related, and we can refer them to those companies for business. So those are the different experiences that I've had. But we've also had situations where companies are also trying to diversify. I'm sure a lot of you have read articles where sometimes Coca-Cola would say, I'm no longer supporting this artist because they came up with homophobic statements and so on in the global world. We also need to bring that to our own countries because Coca-Cola is there also in Zimbabwe. How can we proactively reach out to Coca-Cola and see if they can sponsor a sports tournament on a day, because we believe that Coca-Cola as a brand is inclusive. So it's also looking at that social responsibility in terms of sustaining ourselves beyond just getting the donor funds that we are getting, where the value that we are getting from companies is not just money, but the visibility that they can do through the products that they are also donating to different spaces that we are also creating. But as a community, we've had situations where LBQ women and other groups will come together and do what we call the business festival, where they simply bring the different products that they are selling for other people to interact with those different groups of people who are running different companies and explain to them the products they are selling, where are they getting them, and also supporting each other in business. Because we have a big market of people who love fashion, clothing, decorating our homes and so on. Why not encourage our own community to buy from our own who own certain businesses? But the other dimension also, when we're then looking at the broader business discussion and scope, one of the things that sometimes we fail to do is that when we look at the HIV lens or the sexual and reproductive health lens, a lot of us are taking that piece of work from our own national strategic plans, where these narratives or where these issues are raised, to implement. But we are also not going to business and look at what are the country business strategies or guides that they've developed for development for Zimbabwe, for instance. What is that economic blueprint? Right. What does it look like? Because in those documents, the blueprint speaks about human rights. It talks about good governance. It talks about inclusion. But sometimes we don't locate ourselves in that language because we think it's now business.
Exactly.
But yes, we are citizens before we have a sexual orientation and gender identity. And as a citizen, I can engage in any platform and in any business that I want. But perhaps the challenge we might have is that there are also certain provisions then that are not applied to us when it comes to human rights. For instance, if someone finds out I run a business of a coffee shop where sometimes gay people flock to, there's a likelihood that I might be rated and people make the assumption that we are selling sex or something like that. So how do we make sure in our rights discourse we are also talking about the right to property? Property rights are important. Yes. I have a right to run a business. I need my business to be protected. Because when we're also looking at labor issues, it says everyone has a right to find a job and employment that they want. But then when I'm discriminated, I don't feel like I have the agency or the resilience to go and demand that right. And these are things that we need to unpack among ourselves and realize that as citizens we're entitled to those things. Yeah. And these are the models that we have tried to look at. And lastly, what I want to say is that recently we reviewed our own internal strategy for the next 5 years. And we did a baseline survey with the community. We had a sample of about 500 because it was online with COVID and so on. 30% of the people who responded to the survey had a first degree. About 38% of them had a diploma, but a lot of them are unemployed. So we are sitting at a gold mine of young people who are the biggest shareholders in Africa, but don't have access to resources. How do we utilize that type of demographic young spectrum within our community to actually build business? Yeah. So one of the things that we've been also thinking about and have been brainstorming is how do we also build a business hub, the same way we've built, for instance, key populations platform and so on. So these are the things that have also helped us to refocus and rethink around how we can do business in my experience.
Thank you so much. Okay, I don't want to, that was fantastic. Yeah, I don't want to take too long, but I do want to bring you in with a side question, and this is very much related to what Sam was talking about. And being from SAP, this discussion was had in the previous panel about the role of countries like South Africa, where sort of our rights landscape is a little bit more further along in the spectrum. I'm not going to say better, it's further along in the spectrum from a policy point of view. I would really love to hear about what your thoughts are, Daniel, on the role of businesses, particularly multinational businesses that exist in countries where the policy environment is inclusive, and what they're doing in countries where you know there's no rights, you know, people's humanity is essentially criminalized. What are you doing around your employee base? What are you doing around protecting employees? What are you doing around your engagements with government when you're engaging around social change issues? So would love to bring in, and I don't know if there's more questions. Okay. So let's take the questions, and then you can give that a thought, because I know I just sprung that on you. So please go ahead. Intro first, and then you can answer.
Yes, my name is Kanyo. And I think it follows on very well from the question you've just asked. My question is to Daniel. and I suppose other panelists can also share their perspectives. But the panel has shared really rich, interesting information about how internally within companies are approaching inclusion and protecting the rights of LGBT persons. My question is outward facing. We've been through this whole week talking about the kind of struggles as activists and human rights defenders we are involved in, the struggle against violence by governments, for example. And so when companies make decisions about which, for example, countries they are working in, to what extent is this the struggle against this violence, for example, by governments, a consideration? I'll make an example. In many of our contexts, governments use data in order to harass human rights defenders. They mine data from people's social media, for example, and go after them and harass them, or in many cases perform all kinds of violence against them. So and sometimes in some contexts governments would say, for you to operate as a business, you need to share with us data on certain people, for example, as a mandatory requirement. So when you are making the decision, it's important, I imagine, for business, as a business decision, you decide that it's important for us to have a presence in this country. But when that presence is, you have to balance it with the fact that there are requirements by government which essentially jeopardize LGBT persons or jeopardize human rights defenders. How do companies approach that? And how do you balance your desire to provide your service, but also with the struggle of combating violence and other forms of violation by government?
Okay, let's take that one as well.
Before responding to that question, Kevin online says, one of the biggest challenges we face on the African continent are the differing legislative issues, with some countries still even carrying the death penalty for being queer. Many Pan-African or multinational companies continue to use these legislative challenges as an excuse not to promote or implement LGBTI plus awareness or workplace accommodations or any other programs. Any ideas or advice on how to go about breaking these barriers, courageous leadership aside?
Okay.
Right.
Do you want to start?
So I think I'll share first some of the best practices from ASAP. So being a global company, most of the policies that we have do actually apply globally. It means that within ASAP, for example, we've got offices in Kenya and Nigeria. What it means that when you're within the ASAP Kenya office, you cannot discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation. So this we try and encourage in other areas as far as the Middle East as well. So basically what you're trying to say is that whenever we've got a policy, it doesn't just apply to certain areas, it applies to everyone. This is a way of ensuring that we actually include everyone in this journey. In terms of where we stand as a business, I've seen globally we've had to walk away from some business transactions where we stand in solidarity with a particular cause. I know recently we had to close offices in Russia based on what's going on. This is where we stand in solidarity with people to say, as a business, we weigh different things and say, business aside, but then here is what we need to do from a humanitarian point of view as well. And I think the COVID situation did expose a lot of inequality, especially in South Africa as well. And this has caused us as a company, for example, to reintroduce ourselves, not only to ourselves, but to the external environment as well. Most of the times, businesses are perceived as structures, but we're also human. And we constantly need to check in with one another in terms of where we're standing. And I see this forum as an excellent collaboration whereby we need to engage more and start talking. Because even us as a business, we're trying to repackage ourselves in terms of how best can we reach out to the different communities. But there's always that disconnect. And I think for me what is imperative is for the two sectors to come together and see how we can actually work together.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the issue of countries still having laws and what companies
Yes.
are trying to do.
Yes.
what was interesting recently was that we had a meeting with members of parliament where we were talking about trans issues and intersex rights. And what we brought up was that when you look at the Immigration Act of Zimbabwe, it still says homosexuals, people living with disability, they call them disabled. And the language is very old and very stigmatizing. And prostitutes are not welcome to Zimbabwe. Wow. That's what the Immigration Act is like. So what it means that as long as you're an outsider and you're coming to Zimbabwe and you fall in those three categories, you're not welcome. So one of the things we raised is that law needs to be changed, because a lot of gay people have come to this country. You never ask them what their sexual orientation is. They meet the president and they're doing business. And you say, as a country, you have the mantra of saying we are open for business. What does that mean? A lot of our countries have received money from Elton John. I have not seen anyone saying we don't want that money because it's gay or it's being donated by a gay man.
Yeah.
So when we unpack some of the funding that's coming even from our countries, from billionaires who are LGBTI or donating for poverty relief and so on, it's also coming from gay people. They are also taking taxpayers' money who are gay from Europe, from United States, either through USAID, UNICEF, or whatever. You have never refused it. So some of these draconian laws need to be removed. And they're quite in agreement that perhaps this is an opportunity for us to revisit that act. Because not only was it affecting trans women and men when they are leaving the country, because we've had incidences where someone gets to the airport, they're told, no, you can't go and board a plane because we are dressed this way. They had to strip the person down until they look what they thought was their proper gender. And that was then challenged.
Sure.
So we do have those laws that currently exist. But they were also saying, well, maybe they're also not applying to a gay man who's leaving the country. So I can go in and out as I please, because where some of us are quite known. But it's those kind of things that we need to also revisit. When countries are saying we are not leaving anyone behind, we are open for business, and you still have existing laws that hinder people to come and invest in the country, it's also problematic. And we also indicated to them, look at how much business the pink economy can bring to Zimbabwe. And we're also basing that on the previous position they had long back when Mugabe was still there, where they were promoting tourism in Victoria Falls. And a lot of gay people will flock there, and of course for sex trade. And right now, because of COVID, business is quite low. How do we bring people who have money to spend from our community to a country that still have those laws?
Yeah.
And we linked that to the issue that also came up, I think a few years back, a few months ago, if you were following Zimbabwean media, where Somizi tried to come to Zimbabwe. And there was a whole ruckus about it. Hey, he's gay, why is he coming to our country? The churches wrote a letter and so on. The reason why Somizi was coming to the country was not because of his sexual orientation, but it was because of business. The people who were hiring him to come and host that event had seen the value he could bring to their business in terms of money. Because if he was coming, it means a lot of clients were going to attend that event, and there's a fundraising strategy and establishment of raising the profile of their business was going to shoot.
Yeah.
But that did not happen. But on the other side, just recently, I think it was last week, I saw Mohale flying to Vic Falls, Kariba, he's gay, and he came through, no one said anything. So it's also to look at that type of evidence and bring it to members of parliament to say we actually don't need these laws.
Yeah, those contradictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is quite important for us, even when we live here, to reflect on those, to say how do we use the existing laws to also show them that we can actually change the laws for the development of our own countries.
To hold them to account, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Linda, please go ahead. And I'm getting looks, so I know we should be wrapping up very soon. Let's take the last question.
Yeah, my question to the panelist is, I do agree in some way that we need to be in solidarity to be able to not support those businesses that are homophobic, transphobic, or biphobic. But I'm trying to think again and reflect. If I come from a township And in this particular township, the media is so bloated with all of us striking and saying we will not support ShopRite or whoever it is, or all businesses that are homophobic. I'm thinking about the backlash. What does the backlash mean for us? Because if this is out there and there are homophobic shops that we've never known that they are like that, the owners start stopping us in our townships from not accessing their businesses. And we know we need the tuck shop as the immediate bread that we need to get. What does that mean for us? How do we go around making sure when we really stand in solidarity that the people of our communities are still able to survive, and that the impact and the consciousness that is being raised is able to change the narrative of businesses? Because this is no different from when the movement started, when we said we are going to be out and proud. But we know the backlashes that came with it. Sammy knows how he was beaten up, and those things are no different from the business fraternity, because now only we are entering it. So I just want to know what your thoughts are around it. Think about me in the township with a tuck shop and a supermarket, and that owner is a big homophobe or a big a church man and says no more office in here. What does that play out? Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question, sort of bringing in the role of power dynamics, the ultimate role of power dynamics. Does anyone want to try and tackle that one? David, Sam, Daniel, please feel free. It'll be the last one, and then we will be concluding.
Yeah, maybe I could say something just from from an umbrella standpoint. I think we all have to realize that this is a very long journey, and you do, of course, have to protect the safety and security of community members on a more micro scale. But the message I would like to leave you with is that a lot can be done. It does take time, but it can be done, as long as we're clever, and we're all clever about how we go about this. I think that is important here is that if you remember that businesses are competitive, you can use that, you can leverage that. For example, I do know that there's an index in South Africa that's promoting businesses that are supporting the community. And this might be a way to get more engagement from the business world. And because Workplace Pride does this on a global basis as well, by saying, for example, in Zimbabwe or Malawi, those businesses that are most supportive of diverse communities in general, these are those. These are the ones that are doing really well. And businesses will want to be on that list. And this is a leverage, this is a way to begin to start that conversation. And the community can start that conversation because we come from there. We know which businesses are supportive or not. So again, it's a long journey, but it will work out in the end. And I think if we stick with it and understand that, then we'll make progress ultimately.
Yeah, change is hard. It's long, especially when you look at our own movement. And when you look at that tuck shop within the neighborhood, I have also had experiences where I'll go to my own local tuck shop. I've lived in what I would call high-density suburbs for a long time, where people would not want to save me, or they'll tell you there's no bread, but someone comes after me, they get bread. Then you know, oops, it's because they now know your sexuality. Those things happen. There are some mindsets that are just hard and difficult to change, and they will continue to be there. And I think we've also read, even globally, or even here in South Africa, where people wanted to have weddings, and they've been refused to use the venue, or someone refused to bake a wedding cake. Those businesses are there. But I think it's also important, perhaps, to also look at how do we sensitize businesses within our locality around our issues, the same way we've been sensitizing the healthcare workers and any other members of parliament and so on, because these people are also coming from a certain level of perception of how they've been informed about what LGBTI people are. So if they see a trans woman walking to their tuck shop, they're already frowning and they have an attitude and so on. Some of it is actually coming from ignorance.
It is.
So there is also efforts that we may need to look at, but the effort is two-way. We also have allies within our communities, whether it's that old woman who has embraced us and so on, who can also be an ally in trying to change the space, but there are some people we can't change. Because it has to be a two-way thing. It's not always us trying to change communities. But there are also people within the community that can also help us to change the community. Because you still need that service. And perhaps the only tuck shop in your neighborhood. We have experienced that. So it will take time, but I think it's also about, in my culture, we have this it's not a saying, but this practice where you have a tarred road, but you find people always avoid it and they use the grass. And after a couple of walks, you find there's now a little road forming. It's the same way with how I've experienced the way we change our communities. There has to be someone who has to walk through that road first. Yeah. And there will be thorns. And there will be grass that will trip you and you fell. But with time you find it starts becoming a road. So it's the same thing with homophobia. One or two people accessing that tuck shop or that shop will experience homophobia. But with time, some people begin to change. But it's also generational. It also depends who owns the shop. The last example I want to give is, a few years back, I'm sure the Zimbabweans know this, we used to have these clubs that we all would like to flock to, not because they are gay clubs or they are LGBTI friendly, but for some reason we tend to take over and then it becomes our space and it's safe. So one weekend we all woke up, went to the bar in the evening, and there were posters along the wall. Homosexuals are not welcome. Homosexuals are not welcome. And people that were known then to be homosexuals would be picked one by one, out. It was a pub. Out. And after some time, 1 week, second week, for a club that will fill up almost 200 people, it came to 60. From 60, it went to 20. It almost shut down. Yeah. He removed all that because he was going to lose business. So people start thinking, well, all these people were coming to this pub, homosexuals, they were not. Some were their families, their friends, clients of gay men, lesbian women, and just straight women who like to be among us, who just love that kind of vibe, even if they'd never identified, but being in that place would bring them vibe, and they almost lost business. They took it off. Now some of those places are the best places to go and be, and they've realized they've retained their business. They're even flourishing more than any other businesses around them. Yeah. So it's also, how do we use our power where we are giving someone a business and they're abusing that? We can take that power back by not giving them business.
Thank you so much, Sam. Daniel, tweet length.
Okay, I'll be very brief.
Yes.
And I think for me, we also need to hold the businesses accountable. I think we've heard about being accountable for our spaces and everything. And I think this is why we need to own it and just call them to order to say, you know what? We're calling you accountable for this. This is not acceptable. Just to reiterate what he has said, to say, really, we've also got the power to say no. And we're also influencers in our own sets.
Yeah, thank you so much. This conversation can go on and on. I think there's a lot that we heard today, a lot of richness. I'm not going to try and paraphrase or summarize everything that's been discussed, mostly because I think most of us are hungry. Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing. I think this should continue. We should continue having these conversations because social compacting is important, and business and civil society are two key parts of that. And so the more we can get this right, I think the better. So thank you very much to all of you, and Kopano, we are in your capable hands.